Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new end of the year video for the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea, and we talk about 2022 in music. And right now, we are going to be talking about our favorite songs of the year. August, unfortunately, is not with us today just because he's had a very difficult year. We killed him. He didn't listen to enough music, so we just figured that we just shoot him into space. Fuck him. But he couldn't make it because he has too much stuff on his backlog. He wasn't able to listen to enough stuff, so we figured we could kind of do the best we could with what we had. We have some substantial lists here for you today, and I think I speak for everybody when I say 2022 was a damn good year in music.
We all have our own individual lists, which we've used to kind of compile together and make these videos. But one of the great things about doing these videos is that we often, and I think this is particularly true this year, I mean, it feels like it anyway, we agree on stuff a lot more than we disagree. And so it's very easy to find consensus in terms of these videos. So let it be clear that this is a video where we have essentially tried to find the stuff we agree on the most in terms of what we love this year. And this is true of our songs videos here, but also will be true of our albums videos as well. And what we have is not a list that represents everything on our own individual lists necessarily, but compiled from our own individual lists and from a lot of stuff that we have reviewed throughout the year as well that each of the three of us have come away pretty positive on. So as we have in the last couple of years as well, we've got 20 picks for our favorite songs of the year, limited to one per artist, and we're going to count them down in an orderly fashion. Anyway, without further ado, let's kick off our countdown of the 20 best songs of 2022 with
I hope you find some peace of mind in this life.
Kendrick Lamar's United by Grief. Morgan, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's so special about this lead-off track from Kendrick Lamar's massively hyped and messy as hell album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers?
I've been going through some 1,855 days.
You get it.
Yeah.
This was such an interesting album to listen to begin with, but to discuss and sort of let and marinate. And I think it really starts with its best foot forward with United in Grief. But yeah, there's a lot going on here, mix wise. It's pretty incredible beat on this thing. There's a lot of jazz rap influence naturally, but it's also integrated with like some drum and bass and break beat almost in some places, and I just find it really
listening to this, revisiting this morning, I was like, this instrumentally, this could be right off of fucking Angel in Real Time was the thought I had.
Yeah.
Like, there's
Oh my
there's
God,
lots of extra
yeah.
stuff going on, but it's like, it's funny how these completely different artists that we both love dearly have like created
and how much genre doesn't matter now.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
yeah.
It seems almost, I don't know whether it's a trend or I don't know whether it's just time sort of circling back onto itself, because this kind of drum and bass percussive stuff was obviously big in the early 2000s, but it's funny and just cool, I guess, to hear someone like Kendrick sort of kicking off his album, breaking down the door with something that is so completely out of step with the time in terms of where we're at. I mean, that's one of the prevailing things about Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. It's like sonically it's all over the place. There's a little bit of trap, there's a little bit of drum and bass, there's a little bit of basically everything you could imagine. And the result of that is a record that just sort of feels so, I'm going to say timeless, because out of time, I think is a better way of putting it. And it really and United in Grief, which is just kind of like a microcosm for the whole album in terms of the things that Kendrick raps about in the song and the way that it sort of sets up your expectations for the rest of the record by kind of rug pulling you. I mean, it starts off with those big piano chords and then just completely pulls that sideways and turns into something else entirely. It's a messy song that kicks off a messy album. that represents, a state of mind for Kendrick that is as frazzled and fractured as it's ever been.
I didn't really get to say much about the Kendrick Lamar album when it came out, just because I had to skip that segment. But United in Grief was absolutely a highlight on that album for me, even though, yes, that album is a big mess. But it's the kind of mess that you wouldn't want any other way, because getting a mess like that, like we've talked about this idea in the past, the idea of the big ass mess double album from any great artist is a prospect that, regardless of its execution, is going to be fascinating to dig into, because you're going to get the inevitable high points of their artistic trajectory that they wouldn't otherwise give you unless they had the freedom to do whatever they want. And that's how you get a song like United in Grief. You wouldn't ever get this on another Kendrick Lamar album, and it speaks to the singularity of not only him as an artist, but this project as an album. Regardless of how hot or cold on it you are, it is a novelty in and of itself that it exists. So it's super cool.
Yeah. The overarching theme of the song as well, which is kind of like it's presented as a sort of therapy session, which lays out, I guess, the structure of the whole record and how that is set up as well. And one of the things I like about Mr. Morale, and one of the things that has helped it to grow most in my estimation, is how the whole record essentially is pitched as Kendrick sort of not even just getting in touch with, but just sort of like frankly representing the way he's been for the last several years, which has been basically the ugliest version of himself that he's maybe ever been. Like, he talks about things, he talks about his life, he talks about his relationships from a very sort of self-centered and materialistic and shallow point of view. And one of the overarching themes of that record is kind of Kendrick, through therapy and I guess through confrontation, sort of coming to basically confront those aspects of the way that his worldview has changed as he's become more jaded by his fame, as he's become more jaded by his success. I mean, a lot of it feels like a kind of vulgar response to him being awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. So yeah, United in Grief really gives you a sense of all of that the record itself goes into in a lot more detail. And we talked about that. I think me and Emily really went into that in our review, but that song really sets it all up. And if you want to kind of start to unlock the album itself, because a lot of people have struggled with that record, as myself included, this is where you begin, right? It is the most musically invigorating thing on the record. It's one of the most instantaneous, but it's also one of the most complicated and dense in terms of what Kendrick is throwing at you. I mean, even from his flows, when this song kicks off in his first verse, his flows they're manic, they're bizarre, they're almost off the rails, essentially. Very difficult to keep track of. And that really sets up the entire song. Right, moving down our list. Number 19 is... Right, well, because we're in the early stage of this list, and because, spoiler alert, this is a record that we're going to be talking about in our next video, I won't linger on this too long, other than to say that Cold Burn was absolutely my favorite opening track of the year on any record. I mean, I've become obsessed with Cult of Luna this year, and that obsession started right here with this, which was the first song I ever heard from them when this album came out very early in the year. And it so immediately grabs you. It starts with these massive sort of stabbing monstrous sounds that remind me a little bit of how Portishead's Threads ends on their third album.
Ooh.
And then once you sort of get your head caved in by these massive sounds, you have this incredibly heavy, rhythmic, sort of pummeling, forward-moving tank sound that just sort of starts to consume the track immediately. And you just get a really welcome and quick reminder of how heavy Cult of Luna can be. Because, over the years, the level of heaviness that they've indulged in has fluctuated. You've got a lot of more mellow and atmospheric stuff on records like Marina and their last record, A Dawn to Fear as well. But here you have so much of what makes them such a magnetic and exciting band. Post-metal and sludge metal, I feel like, are aspects and areas of metal that have... I don't know if it's fair to say they've gone out of fashion, but they're just sort of not as big in the world of metal as they maybe used to be. And a lot of the touchstones of sludge metal, bands like Neurosis and Isis, are either like they haven't been together for years, or in the case of Neurosis, kind of mired in a bit of controversy, as well. So sludge metal and post metal kind of feel like they're in a bit of a, I don't want to say a dark period, but sort of having been forgotten a little bit. So it's nice to be able to say that Cult of Luna, with the opening track on their new album, have kind of delivered one of the most seminal sludge metal songs that I can think of in several years, to be honest. It's not just how punching and violent this song is from the intro, but just how many amazing riffs and sections that they cycle through, where they're playing with rhythm, where they're playing with texture, where they're doing all the things that you would expect and want out of sludge metal, and so much more as well. And it's something I'll talk a little bit more about in our albums video as well, but you can't fault for a second the sound of this either. I mean, sludge metal, post metal, it's a very specific sound, and but you can take it in a number of different directions. Like you can go really grimy, or you can go into this kind of like post rock adjacent, sort of very sort of polished to a sheen direction, which is what Cult of Luna do, and it makes it some of the most beautifully heavy music of the year as well.
This motherfucker sound like a freight train. Like every time I put it on, I'm like, how did they get it to sound like this? Because I can picture every instrument in its own place within the mix, and I'm like, okay, this all makes sense to me. But I'm missing the link of how it came together to sound like I am getting run over.
It does really legitimately feel like a fucking steam train. Like, just it's the drumming, I think, is what does that as well. It's just so propulsive and so steady, and just completely continues pushing you deeper and deeper into this space as well. It's so fucking good.
The fucking guitar work in this song is ludicrous. Like, past the 3.5 minute mark, the guitarist of this band is just absolutely on one in a way that few bands this year, sans gospel maybe, have been. And you know, we're all metalheads, so it's easy for us to get excited about stuff like this, but it feels like this is a song that I feel like you could show to practically anybody, and it'd be really hard for me to find somebody I know that I feel like wouldn't be impressed by this. It's also just a chief example of, when we talk about like the production on albums, we often talk about compression and how that is a tool that's often used to sort of pick up the slack of modern records, and how it can often be kind of misapplied. Whereas on Cold Burn, I think this is a virtuosic display of how you can use the art of compression to make your song as big, as dense, as brutal as possible. Because it's like Morgan said, every single instrumental idea on this, like, the guitars sound like horns, the horns sound like guitars, the synths sound like, I don't even fucking know what the synths sound like, but all of it sounds wrong, but all of it sounds big, and it just caves your fucking skull in the most fucking ooga booga fucking lizard brain way that you want music like this to do.
Another reason why I think this is one of the most notable metal songs of the year as well is that something that I didn't find out until long after the album came out, but I think is incredibly cool, is that as a part of the, I guess, press for this album, or as a part of the rollout for this album, Cult of Luna teamed up with I can't remember what it was called, but it was some kind of like games manufacturer, a games designer, to create a kind of like immersive video game music video for this song. And you can actually download it on Steam. I don't even remember if it's free or not, but if it's not free, it's super cheap. It's kind of like somewhere between sort of like a walking simulator and like just a pure sort of interactive visual experience. And it's like this super—
That's so raw.
It's this super like intriguing and awesome idea for like how to create a media accompaniment to a metal song as well. I mean, especially one that's, you know, from a genre and from a sound as kind of atmospheric as sludge metal tends to be as well. So I thought that was a really, really cool idea. And I highly recommend going and checking it out on Steam. It's a neat little experiment that shows just how kind of at the cutting edge of metal Cult of Luna are. And even though they've been around for like 25 years, they are restless, and they are basically devoted to refining their sound and refusing to stagnate, even as they work in a genre that isn't exactly super easy to innovate in without changing things up too dramatically. Every record that Cult of Luna put out, I say this as someone who's become a fully fledged obsessive fanatic of them. Every record they put out finds some new way to tweak the formula, and that change and that difference is what makes each release they put out so fascinating and so essential, I think. But anyway, Cold Burn, it doesn't get much better than this for metal in 2022. All right, number 18 on our list is
I thought I was going crazy, you know?
I'm quite pleased that this ended up on our list of, our collective list of the best songs of the year, even though I was the only person who put it on an individual list, because to me, we talked a lot about Joey Badass earlier this year, his new album 2000, which I like a lot, but definitely is one of those records where its best moments really stand out above and beyond the entire album experience as a whole, because there were just moments on that record that really let it down. But it really comes through in the home stretch with one of Joey's most poignant songs. It is, of course, a dedication to Capital Steez, the incredible pro-era rapper who essentially came up with Joey. They were childhood friends, passed away at 19 by suicide, of course. And we talked about this a little bit when we reviewed 2000 as well, how the shadow of Steez has kind of hung over all of the music that Joey has done in the interim. And he throws festivals for the guy. He does so much to celebrate and commemorate the life of his friend. And so on a record like 2000, where he's kind of calling back, it's a direct sequel to his 1999 mixtape, which is his breakthrough release. Of course, he's going to want to pay tribute to Steez. And this song it's brutal. I mean, it's heartbreaking. It's gorgeous. I mean, the sample is amazing. The production's fantastic. Joey himself he's not austere or like distancing himself from his emotions. He really lets you know how he's feeling. He really lets you know how much his relationship to Steez meant to him. And the way he does that is by taking you back through stories of the time where they came up and the experiences that they had together, and how he feels now looking back on what he could have done, should have done before Steez died, or even to have potentially have prevented that from happening. He talks about, the way that people have spoken about him in regard to Steez as well. Like, there's people who have accused him of having a role in Steez's death, if not directly, then contributing towards the state of mind, or I guess the intensity of the public eye that was put on them that may have contributed to Steez's death. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that has been leveled at Joey, or that Joey has shouldered the burden of in the wake of Steez's death as well. But also his relationship with Steez's family as well, complicated shit that isn't always very easy to talk about, isn't always very cut and dry, isn't always very predictable, and isn't always very pretty either, or, something that feels like it can be made into a beautiful tribute necessarily. I mean, there's ugliness in this song, and that's what makes it such a great tribute as well, is that it's so emotionally complicated. It really lets you feel for 5 or 6 minutes, the colossal difficulty that is dealing with the death of a friend, and how the shadow of that follows you. There's this devastating line here as well, where he talks about how Steez passed away 2 days before his birthday. And then he kind of references that classic Kanye line, "We weren't supposed to make it past 25 from We Don't Care." And he's like, my brother never made it to 25. And it's a simple thing, but like that little thing. And when you realize that reference, and of course, how much of a standard and influence and massive impact Kanye and those first couple of Kanye records had on basically the full generation of rappers that would come up in the wake of that, including the pro era rappers like Joey and Steez. It's a hard moment. It's a hard moment. And then you get this a really nice outro as well, this extra guest verse from Ab-Soul, who talks about, meeting Steez at a time when Steez was sort of just coming up, and no one sort of really had any idea what the future was going to hold for anyone. And just talking about as someone who has so much more of a distance, or had so much more of a distance from Steez than Joey did, just talking about how that brief encounter left a real impact on him. And I guess in terms of legacy songs, there's so many rap songs and rap records this year that have dealt with legacy. Artists like Joey or like Nas, or like we've reviewed a whole bunch of hip hop this year, and a lot of it has been concerned with legacy to one degree or another, like marking time and then looking back and seeing, how things have changed since, the heyday, the good old days. And a lot of it is about the idea of celebrating legacy, idea of celebrating how, while we may not be, at the place where we were when we were at our biggest, the passage of time and the way that's changed us and the way that we've shifted into this new space in the world of our culture, essentially, and in our own lives, is a beautiful thing, right? And is a thing that we want to celebrate. So there's a lot of stuff about legacy here, but Survivor's Guild is different because this is a song about the legacy of someone else. It's a hip hop song about someone else's legacy, not your own, right? And that's one of the things that makes it stand out as a song this year, but also even on Joey's record, where so much of it is him reflecting on how things have changed since 1999. But to hear a song about someone else's legacy and how no matter what you do and no matter what you think of yourself and no matter what you try to carve out in terms of your own discography, your own artistic profile, all that sort of stuff, you'll never fully be able to separate yourself from, or your own legacy will never necessarily matter as much as the legacy of someone you've lost. That shit is really profound, frankly. And and so that's why this song really stands out to me as one of the best of the year, because it offers a perspective and, gives you 5 minutes of a beautiful beat and of hard-ass lyricism to really reflect on that. And it's why it's one of my favorite songs of the year. Number 17 on our list is
I woke up with you in my head.
On the note of like Cult of Luna as well, similar sort of story for me. I discovered this artist with their new record, essentially, an artist I'd always been aware of, an artist I'd always thought, hey, I probably would like this artist if I really got into them. But it took the Jams and Tea podcast and it took a new album for me to really be able to make that discovery, right? And that was what happened for me this year with Regina Spektor's Home Before and After, right? Like it's, in a way that's not dissimilar to a number of other albums we've kind of shouted out that won't make our albums of the year list. It's a messy record. It's a record for Regina where she's coming back after a period of time and she's kind of pushing herself creatively in a few different directions. And, when we reviewed it, we were all broadly pretty positive about it, but I think that the disparate nature of the directions that Regina pushes herself in on that record definitely meant that it wasn't going to be something we could ever be fully unified on, with the exception of this song, right? Because this song is the centerpiece of that album. It is, I think, Regina's longest song ever, I want to say. It's about 8.5 minutes long, and it is truly an opus, right? It truly is a song that feels like Regina has, you really get the sense of, because it has been 6 years since her last record before this, of her having, crafted and worked towards creating something truly, ambitious for her, right? And this song really realizes that in so many different ways. It's a song about, where Regina is kind of like thinking about physics and thinking about her understanding of the way the world works on a physical level, and how even when physicists and people who try to understand the world on that level try to basically come up with the answers that allow us to explain why things exist the way they do, when they hit a brick wall, they often turn to philosophy. They often turn to a way of understanding that is not empirical, essentially, that is not based on direct observation, that's based more on something spiritual. And so extrapolating from that more broadly, the song is about, how you reconcile the tangible, sort of quantitative nature of the world, essentially, with the sort of qualitative, spiritual, intangible nature of how you perceive and understand the world, essentially, how you reconcile your own experience of the world, your own understanding of things, with the truth that exists separate from you. And I guess you could extrapolate that even further and say that it's a song about how you reconcile yourself and the world itself, these two separate things, this internal thing that can be the only thing you fully understand, but this also entire world that you exist within that's completely unknowable, and how you navigate that. And that's what the song is about, right? Broadly speaking, that's the kind of shit that Regina writes about, right? And she does it very abstractly. She talks about light and time, and she tells the story of her life, or at least envisions the story of her life as being like a fairy tale that she's telling to her son. And she repeatedly says that there's no such thing as time, and there's no such thing as mine as well. Like really starting to reconcile and understand her existence outside of the constructs of ownership and time that, you know, we all impose on ourselves to understand our existence and our perception better. And it just goes on and on and on like this, right? And there's this poignancy to the way in which Regina is framing this as a story that she's telling to her son. She's framing this as almost like, you know, this is a struggle of understanding that every adult to some degree, you know, deals with over their life, especially the older they get. And here is her, I guess, essentially preparing her son for that in some ways. She says at one point, "The story must go on, so keep listening, my son. And if you get too tired, build a little fire. The pages may burn, but the words can just return. You will learn, you will learn, you will learn." And the song ends with her sort of saying, you will learn, over and over again. And then there's like this hilariously doomy chordal change that happens as well. And she starts sounding like a kind of demon when she's saying that. And it's full of Regina's sense of humor. It's full of her, you know, big ideas about existence and perception and understanding in the world. And also it is just musically incredibly captivating. And there's gorgeously booming strings. There's delightful little melodies that are mostly performed on piano as well. She's an incredibly accomplished pianist. And yeah, it's just an awesome ass song that I think is really unique, really so packed with ideas, essentially, that it almost feels like Regina doesn't even know what to do with it. And I think this year for me has been definitely a year of like coming to really have a bit more of an appreciation for art that's like a little bit more deliberately messy and a little bit more obviously the product of an artist who has so many ideas or so much passion or so much drive that they don't even know how to like hone that at all. It just kind of falls out of them. And that's something I might have been a bit more critical of a couple of years ago, you know, really prizing art where it's all very much, you know, honed to perfection. But with Regina's record, with this song, with so much of the music on my lists this year, I am just captivated by art that is all about pure energy, essentially just coming out of you. And Regina is an artist who that is kind of one of her principal musical philosophies, I would say. So much of her music just feels like it is an energy that's being plucked out of her. And it's messy and it's sometimes cloying and it's sometimes overbearing, but it's never in any way the result of compromise. Yeah. Anything you guys want to add on this track?
Sounds like God.
All right. Number 16 on our list is...
I remember when we reviewed debut album from Chat Pile, we went on for quite some time about how memorable, I guess we could say, this song Pamela is. I still don't really know how to talk about it. It's just simply one of the most despondent things I've ever heard in my life, as it has burrowed into my brain and taken up a little horrid black space in it ever since the album's release. An album that is hilarious as often as it is devastating. Sometimes it's both of those things at the same time.
This is one of those tracks, and it's true of many on the record, where you get a sense of like, because we talk about a lot of music that is very dark. We talk about a lot of music, especially that comes from a rock or industrial space, that really embodies darkness in terms of like how it tends to be, how we tend to experience it now in the 2020s, essentially, how darkness manifests itself, what, personal darkness, the relationship between, our personal experiences of darkness and, the wider socio-cultural political darkness that colors that, right? Yada, yada, yada. But one of the things that makes Chat Pile so good, and one of the things that makes every song they write so powerful, is how well they're able to channel that sense of absurdity that comes with darkness, especially the longer you spend in it as well. The longer you spend being depressed, the longer you spend, lingering on something, the longer you spend being completely torn apart by something, the more absurd it starts to feel. And no, in my relationship with this song specifically is like a beautiful embodiment of that absurdity, because I can't remember if we talked about this when we reviewed the album or not, but like the first few times when you just listen to the song and you just take in the story that's being told, essentially, of this devastated mother essentially who's lost her child and is kind of just lingering in this horrific state of grief, staring at the lake, waiting to die, wondering if she can lift her son's body from the water through the weight of her pain alone, all that sort of stuff. And then you go onto the Genius page or you go and read an interview with the band or whatever, and you read that this song is named after and from the perspective of one Pamela Voorhees of the film Friday the 13th.
Wow.
Yeah,
and you're like,
I knew that.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
I tried to forget it.
And but this is the thing that elevates it even more, right? Is because if you've seen Friday the 13th, you probably, in all likelihood, think that it's a garbage film, which it is. It's a really trashy, and it's part that's part of the appeal, to be fair. It's not something that completely, negates any of its artistic merit, but it's not exactly a film that's, packed full of emotional intelligence necessarily. It's something where the crudeness of the way it's all conceived does lend it a kind of emotional power, essentially, especially given some of the story beats in terms of like the lore behind, Jason and his mother. But this is like a genius song in a certain sense, because when you experience it for the first time, you probably don't know that that's what it's about. And it essentially is able to take these elements of this story, it's able to, remove them from that context and give them this enormously heavy weight that will completely forever change the way you think about Friday the 13th. Maybe if you rewatch it, that will be dulled slightly by the fact that the movie itself is nowhere near as potent as this telling of its principal story is. But regardless, and that aside, that reality of what the song is written about, which is so Chat Pile, right? It's so true to the nature of the particularly morbid sense of humor that is embodied in so many of their songs. It's also a great embodiment of what I was talking about before, about how the longer you spend, consumed essentially by a darkness of some kind, or by a depression of some kind, or by a grief of some kind, the more you begin to find absurdity in all of it. And the reality of this song being so essentially absurd, after you have been sort of submerged in its very real and very ugly and very brutal emotional tone, that is a great way of, I guess, communicating that feeling. So yeah, it's a bonkers, brutal, just horrific song. It may not even be the darkest or the funniest song. I mean, not that it's funny in the first place, but it may not be the darkest or even the most absurd song on the record in terms of subject matter and the way that that's communicated, but sure as hell is one of the ones that sticks with you the most. Like, it just is, it's like, it's something you can't shake off. And so, I would advise listening with caution. This cheapens it somewhat, but I feel like this is the kind of song that could be, years down the line on a list of, most disturbing songs, along with like fucking Frankie Teardrop and I don't know, Throbbing Gristle's Hamburger Lady or something. It's just one of those tracks that feels destined for that. And yet it is, when you're experiencing it, so much more than just the sensationalism of its brutality. Number 15 on our list is
There's maybe only one other album this year that I've heard that embodies the maximum limit of what a closing track can do in the way that Cave In's Wavering Angel did. Wavering Angel, like the 12.5 minute epic, sludgy, progressive closer to this triumphant, endlessly rewarding and exciting return from Cave In after the loss of their bassist and eventually lead vocalist, at least when it came to the screaming and the growling and such, but which is a loss that naturally permeates the entirety of the record in some form or another, whether it's directly on a song like Reckoning or indirectly on Wavering Angel or New Reality, or I mean, it's just everywhere. It's inescapable, and Wavering Angel feels like the culmination of both it and everything the album has been doing musically up to that point. It's just a moment in heavy music, similar to Coldburn, and a handful of others that happened this year. They are pretty rare, but you do know them when they are happening.
The cool thing about this song is that it manages to sum up an album that is 70 minutes long in about 12 minutes, which, I mean, that's a long ass song, so you got a lot of time there. But the way it starts off as a comparatively more minimal song and then just kind of builds and builds and builds, and by the time you're at the center point of this track and you just have this disgusting riff with just one of the best grooves on any metal song, I was going to say this year, but potentially ever. And then you've got the lead vocalist on that last line where he's just like, let yourself fly. It's like, fuck, holy shit. It really gets the people going. It manages to accomplish everything you could possibly want. The platonic ideal of the epic metal album closer, and that's just, it's a beautiful thing when you get something that's as skillfully executed as this by a group of musicians who are clearly operating at the top of their form. And this is like, the whole album is the top of their form, and this is the top of that form. So it's like, this is a treat. This is like what we said about the War on Drugs album last year, where we're just like, it feels like I should have to pay a subscription fee to be able to listen to this. Absolutely applies to this as well.
I mean, it feels like we've talked a lot, because we have the taste that we do. We've talked a lot about, like music that channels a kind of real classic sort of heavy metal sort of rock feel, essentially, music with solos and guitar lines like the ones on this track, music that feels so obviously taken from the 70s and 80s and all that sort of stuff. We talked a lot about music this year that does what the Cave In record does, more or less, that kind of pulls together, ancient and older forms of rock and metal and pulls it into this very modern sounding and fresh take on a lot of its genre aesthetics, but none have done that as powerfully or as potently as Cave In did. And this is just such a killer closer. Like, I'm glad that our list has, like, already we're not even like we're 6 songs in, and already our list has had like an absolutely textbook perfection metal opener and an absolutely textbook perfection metal closer, to be honest, to showcase how these albums have really stood out. So we'll be talking a little bit more about Cave In the next video, but just know that Wavering Angel is, it makes the entire journey feel worth it, and it makes the entire journey feel so exciting to dive into again, because you're going to get that finale. Just such good shit. Number 14 on our list. I am glad that this song ended up on our final list, especially because I feel like Asphalt Meadows was like, it was almost good enough, I think, to make our albums of the year video, and it would have been really cool if it had, just because it's like a legacy act who've kind of fallen off for like the best part of a decade, and have really come back with one of their best records, at least, certainly the best record they've put out since Narrow Stairs, maybe Vincent's Plans, if you want to get that enthusiastic. It's a really good album anyway.
I would.
It's not a record that has dropped in my estimation at all since it came out. And it's also tellingly as well, it's a record where I feel like we could really have a debate around the best track, to be honest. We could really have a debate around what could be best chosen to represent its strengths. But to be honest, this was the song that it felt like, at least in music press as well as in the conversations that we had about this record as well, this was the song that came up the most frequently. I think this is the song that stands out the most, especially in terms of being something that is a bit stylistically different for Death Cab as well, while still feeling like it embodies their strengths through and through and gives each member of the band a chance to shine. Foxglove through the clear cut. Morgan, what's special about this song? What's unique about it? Why is it one of your favorite songs of the year?
Yeah, this came in at number 6 on my personal list. It's not only something that I feel like we haven't really gotten from Death Cab in quite a while, at least in terms of quality. I don't think they've released anything this good, certainly since Narrow Stairs, but honestly, I probably like this more than anything on that album. It's just nice to have them back in that sense, but it also feels like, specifically with this song, it's not just a return to quality, but a sort of indication that the band are still willing to and have a vested interest in paving new ground for what they can do musically or what they're interested in, and that new ground can be really compelling. They're sort of like this almost Old Man in the Sea-esque story being woven throughout this song, and that's really incredible to see fold out. But what helps, I think, is that this is certainly the best sounding Death Cab song since Chris Walla's departure.
And a big part of that
It's
is
just-
due as well to the production of John Congleton too, who's kind of like an indie rock sort of savior, essentially. He's one of those guys, who you can reliably get on board to really push up the sound and really elevate and give a bit more heft to indie rock music specifically. He's really good at that.
It manages to, and in no small part due to Congleton's contributions, it manages to sound exactly and only like a Death Cab song, but also sort of sound like something they've never really done before. And it's so exciting and rewarding to listen to, and it also at least gets me excited for what the future of this band holds.
It really inspires confidence though, because I don't think it was the first single, but this was the first song I heard from this album before the album itself came out. And it's like, it feels like such a left turn. It's such a deep cut as well to release as a single too, because it's such a slow burn, and it doesn't necessarily immediately inspire confidence when you have like a kind of very slowly building musical progression and Ben Gibbard doing spoken word. But it just ends up building into something that is so much bigger and huger and more expansive than anything that's been on any record that they've done since, basically since Narrow Stairs. And that has a sense of like musicality and satisfying progression to it, especially by the time you get to the huge finale of the song, that feels like, the sky is suddenly the limit for Death Cab after years and years of barely even bothering to jump. It's very, very cool, and it's an awesome song, and we may be overrating it slightly because of how fucking cool that feels to be able to say about a Death Cab song in 2022. But nevertheless,
I'm absolutely not overrating it. This song is just fucking outstanding. I mean, like, how often do you get basically a traditional emo act kind of infusing their, actually, I can't believe I never made this comparison when we reviewed the album. But like the almost post-rocky ethereal vibe that the first half of this track exudes. I mean, this is basically something that you would find off of like the debut of like fucking Whenever If Ever. And the fact that more people don't take from that kind of like playbook, that kind of World's a Beautiful Place / kind of Explosions in the Sky-esque sort of, you know, sprawling sound. It's a treat. And whenever somebody like Congleton, you know, puts their hat in the ring in terms of trying to accomplish that, of course it's going to be a standout for this kind of sound, for this kind of thing. And that's what makes this album in particular so unique and so invigorating, is that they get to be one of the bands that come back and capitalize off of their old strengths, like a lot of great bands did this year, but they also infuse it with something that feels quintessentially of the moment and proves that they have a vitality and staying power that maybe you would have been convinced that they didn't have anymore if you've listened to their last few albums.
All right, moving further down our list, number 13 goes to...
You could basically stop me at just saying this is a Weeknd song that sounds like it wouldn't be out of place on like a War on Drugs album. The way this thing sounds is fucking incredible. I mean, the OPN production that you know, that Abel has been indulging in with his past 2 records has been pretty fucking faultless across the board, frankly. But the closer, or at least the proper closer on Dawn FM, really kind of sealed the deal for me. And this has been a song I've gone back to over and over and over again, sort of on my permanent rotation of pop songs that I listen to on a regular basis, as are a bunch of songs on this record. But this sort of feels like the defining effort, which just it just has so many ideas that you wouldn't figure somebody like The Weeknd would be playing with right now. Like, I mean, the sparkling acoustic guitar at the very end and the outro of the song is gorgeous. I love those OPN style synths, and it's also just got some of the catchiest hook writing that he's had in, like, I think this kind of trounces over stuff that he made in like his proper pop era, because I mean, like, the moment he comes in with the "'cause I can't get you out of my head," like, that is a chorus that people in the 80s, that from the sort of wheelhouse that Abel's drawing from, that is the kind of chorus that someone dreams they could write in terms of melody, in terms of catchiness. It is just the epitome of what he feels like he's capable of right now. And I feel like this going forward is going to be like a future standard for him. Like, this isn't exactly like a hit or anything, but you know, people who are more into the deep cuts of his work, I feel like, are going to say that in the future that this song is deeply underrated and sort of epitomizes this sort of current era of his music. As you know, we talked about Dawn FM a lot, and how a lot of it does feel like sort of an elaboration on his sound off of After Hours, and that leads to some moments, while still being good, being rather inessential on that album, even if you still really, really enjoy them and if they're really well put together. But this feels like the most essential moment on that record, a moment, or an album that's sort of comprised of really strange, more fringe ideas that Abel's been playing with, whereas this is just like maximal in all the ways you want it to be. And yeah, I mean, it's just a terrific fucking pop song. Of all the songs on this album that I think deserved like greater radio play, stuff like Sacrifice with that Giorgio Moroder guitar line shit, like, this is the one that I feel like really, like, this deserves to be on the radio over half the shit that I've heard this year. Fucking get fucked, Walker Hayes. Make room for good music. God damn it.
Walker Hayes is such a random dude to go after in this example, but look, fair enough.
I've had to hear that fucking Applebee's song so much this year, and I haven't heard this play one goddamn time, so I have a vendetta.
It's a particular type of Weeknd song that has come to be like kind of the best kind of Weeknd song to me. You know, it's the same type of song as I Feel It Coming, for instance, or like Hardest to Love or whatever. Like, it's this particular
Save Your
kind
Tears,
of,
Hardest
like,
to Love.
It's this particular kind of like, you know, it's like 4 a.m. sort of like slow dancing on the club floor, you know, and just like completely exhausted, but at the same time just like not wanting to go home yet. And just, it's one of those, it's this particular vibe that you get from this particular song, and The Weeknd's like great at shoving these tracks in on, the back half of, his records. And yeah, it's beautiful. It's just, I obviously wasn't a huge fan of the album, but I can't deny how hard this song hits, especially at the end of that run as well. Because The Weeknd is tired, right? That's the theme almost of Dawn FM to a certain extent, is that he's saturated, he's overwhelmed, he's stressed out. And a moment like this where he could just purely kind of cut loose and just fucking give you that saucy voice and just let you kind
and
of
the gang
collapse into
vocals
it.
on the end chorus.
Yeah, it's
oh
so
god,
good.
this pulls out all the stops for everything you could want in a modern pop song. Like, this is one of the few pop songs that I would say is as good as, any given track on the new Always album, for example. It feels like it's just at its most maximal, where you're utilizing every component and every idea that can be in a pop song, and you're just like capitalizing on it. It's the kind of thing that really genuinely feels slaved over to be perfect.
Number 12 on our list is it feels like they're a dime a dozen now, these sort of slightly industrial, militaristic post-punk bands. But really, Preoccupations, formerly known as Viet Cong, formerly known as Women, have been around for a long time. They've been doing what they do very, very well, and they've been doing it for a while. But I was really taken with how much potency they had on this new record, both in the song that we've chosen here, Slowly, but also in the other song that we very nearly put here as well, Ricochet, and in any number of the other tracks on their brand new record. I mean, just some of the most colorful and vibrant, which is both very funny things to say about Preoccupations if you know their music very well, but just some of the most immediate and satisfying music that they've put out this year. It's just it's the fucking Peter Hook-esque bass lines that are all over the songs on this record. It's my favorite aspect of Slowly in particular, but also just the way that Matt Flegel's vocals just sort of like provide this surprisingly soulful counterpoint to the bass line as well. Like, it's been a while since I've heard him sounding as kind of longing as he is on this song as well. And it really does emphasize that New Order-esque vibe as well that I was kind of referencing to. And it's true of multiple tracks on here as well. It's true of Ricochet as well. It's true of the fantastic closer on this record as well, Tearing Up the Grass. Or the other reference point as well, which is, again, just another secondhand thing because it's also referencing these same original things, is like the vibes of No One Can Even Know era Twilight Sad are absolutely huge on this too. Yeah. Is that same sort of industrial cold wave, very militaristic drum pattern. I mean, it's almost like it sounds like it's kind of broken, the drum pattern here. It sounds like a drum machine that's kind of sputtering out of control, flashing up against these vocals again, like with Twilight Sad, like with New Order, which are surprisingly soulful, surprisingly emotive, surprisingly just giving you this extra level of potency that provides a counterpoint. And, Preoccupations are fantastic. That's their whole shtick, right? Not to mention as well, the other thing that makes the Twilight Sad reference feel particularly obvious, the absolutely kind of siren-esque synth lines that are all over these songs as well. They're huge. They're loud in the mix. They cascade and almost overwhelm at certain points as well. But God, this whole combination is it's catnip.
Feels like this year has been a particularly post-punky year for this podcast. I mean, we're always advocating that kind of music just because I think generally we're very big fans of lots of big and small acts that dabble in that sound. But this has one of the best hooks of the year that's not a vocal hook. It's a guitar hook. And it's just that perfectly reverbed guitar that starts out the song that's just... it's crisp, it's beautiful, it's exactly the kind of thing you want from this kind of stuff, this kind of industrial sort of, angular shit. And this album does a phenomenal job across every single song that I think, like, this feels really more like a placeholder for every single song on this album because it's such a consistent record, but every single part of it feels like it's put together to be its own hook. And I feel like that's something that adds to the vitality of the record that made me kind of... I mean, I get why music like this isn't seen as particularly cutting edge or vital or isn't like super popular right now, but it made me feel like this album this year was particularly underrated by people just because it feels like there's so much thought into the construction of these songs that, like, yes, there's thoughtfulness here, but it's thoughtfulness in service of being hooky and punchy and immediate in a way that, like, you know, not all contemporary music necessarily is.
Mm, absolutely, as well. And I think one of the things I love the most about the song, one of the things that really made me put it high on my list, is that, you know, lyrically, it's very, very, it's hard hitting, and it reminds me a lot of another one of my favorite sort of post punk songs of the last 10 years, which is Proto Martyr's Maidenhead, with just this particular lyrical passage where Matt's like, at 4 o'clock in the morning with the world spinning slowly, when you hate what you've become and you're waiting for the day, but the day waits for no one. That, to me, that idea of like constant suspension, like every day feels like a still moment that you're stuck inside of. That feels particularly true.
Every day is exactly the same.
That feels just particularly true to how I've experienced 2020 as being like a cascade of days that feel like single individual moments that you're stuck inside of. And I hate that I just inadvertently referenced a late era U2 song with that sentence. Let's move on. Number 11 on our list is
Free in the knowledge.
In many ways, I feel like Free in the Knowledge is a direct descendant of How to Disappear Completely off of Radiohead's Kid A.
It has that same kind of like slightly discordant sort of overhanging string sound as well when it comes into. That definitely reminds me of that as well.
I can see the argument that there are more interesting or new things happening on this album. But as for the thing that shot right through my heart, yeah, Free in the Knowledge is that. I've come back to this song so often throughout this year. It was a single in the lead up. The first one that I really paid any attention to, I think.
It's a showcase of why, like, I know the sort of meme is that it's just like, aha, it's Radiohead, but like, you know, a different thing. And this is a different project. You know, we do have a different drummer. We do have some members of Radiohead that don't contribute to this, but it does showcase sort of one of the unsung heroes of Radiohead's career, which is Nigel Godrich. I think that his work producing and engineering this is just as vital to this album and this song's success as all of the musicians are, because this is, like, without question, I think one of the most beautiful sounding songs of the year. Again, that sort of How to Disappear Completely comparison, I think, rings true, not just in that it has sonic similarities, but the similarities in scale, the sort of swell that it builds to, the beautiful sort of acoustic strumming, and just lots of little singular ideas that I think make this album so freeform and liberating and special, in that it feels like these musicians that are often very tightly wound, very fussy, getting to cut loose and show a side of them that they don't always get to show, and it allows for the songs to sort of reflect that in a sort of personality that you don't often see. Like, I think about stuff like the ending of this song, which just sort of meanders into spaciousness, and then there's just like this twinkling little synth that happens at the end after the melodic
is my
line is
favorite
over.
part of the whole song, when that little synth
Right?
comes in. I adore that so much.
I always look forward to that. It sounds like you're hearing something echoing inside of like a vast ocean. And it reminds me of it reminds me of How to Disappear Completely. It reminds me of Weird Fish's Arpeggi too. It reminds me of other Radiohead songs, but it still feels like this is its own thing, because for as similar as this project is to a lot of what Radiohead have done in the past, and that I think that this is sort of a synthesis of Hail to the Thief and Kind of in Rainbows and kind of a moon-shaped pool, and that it does feel like there is a sort of looseness and a sort of brightness that In Rainbows has, but also a sort of world-weary kind of prettiness that a moon-shaped pool has, that feels like it really does feel like it's taking from their career, but it also feels like this is an album that wouldn't fully make sense as a Radiohead album. And this is also a song that I feel like wouldn't fully make sense as a Radiohead song. So not only is it utilizing all of these musicians' particular strengths, but it's like harnessing something that's very unique and utilizing its placement within these musicians' canon to exemplify all of its singular strengths to just create something really atmospheric and really beautiful. And it's just a highlight on an album that's, I think, full of highlights.
Yeah, there's a few things that really stand out to me about this song. First of all, Tom York's vocal on this song, the power in his voice and the way he says, especially when he just hits certain notes or he hits certain lines with a particular power that I don't think I've heard from him in a long time, not even on Moonshaped Pool, which was a record where he was very much, for the most part, singing in much more dour tones. And in fact, speaking of that dourness, I was reminded a lot of the Numbers off of that record, both in the sort of folky classical feel of the acoustic guitar melody as well, particularly when it comes in at the start of the song or at the first part where you hear it. And the strings themselves, while there's like that dissonance that starts off the song, definitely echoes How to Disappear completely. The size of the strings on this track feel very much of a piece with Moonshaped Pool as well. They have that same sort of, there's a similar feel of layering, and maybe just the amount of different string players in the orchestra that Johnny is conducting, that feels like it is very similar to how he conceived the strings for that record too. It's just this oasis of pure gorgeousness in the middle of this record that's very much rhythmically focused. You get very few moments of just pure sort of folky bliss like this. And it's just one of the things that makes it stand out so much immediately, I think. Finally reaching the top 10 of our favorite songs of the year, kicking it off with
SRO just really feels like a moment in music this year where it, like, everything that came before this on the record, it lets rest assured that Gospel are back and as good as they've ever been. But SRO is sort of the moment where it was like, oh no, this isn't just them coming back and being as good as they've ever been. This is them being better. This is them being farther reaching. This is them being even more ambitious than they have been in the past. It starts off with those really sort of sticky synth passage that's just absolutely flattened by this squalling, screeching guitar sound that's one of the most key characteristics of Gospel as a band. That's sort of an overriding theme throughout their sound, is that their guitar tones just sound fucking otherworldly. And on here, that is absolutely no exception. And from that point forward, it just keeps going and going and going, for the point where it gets to like the 2.5 minute mark where there's actually finally vocals there. The song has basically already gone through 3 different passages, 3 different sections of progressive music where it's just building and building, and then you get that kind of those simmering just meaty ass fills that are on this song and on this entire record. The drummer just absolutely going off, and man, it's just everything about this is designed to be so invigorating. It almost has a build that feels post-rocky in nature, but all of it feels so active. It feels so vital, and it's fucking thermal in terms of just like the temperature of it. You feel the sort of anxiety in the song rising and rising and rising, and the tension in it is flawlessly dispersed in the final sort of segment of the song. But it sort of like breaks away in that kind of like when it's got about like a minute and a half left. You just sort of feel the jazziness that this band sort of sometimes harnessed on their debut album in full force, to the point where it feels like you're listening to like a late era Miles Davis album if it was also a post-hardcore record. And it's just like there is just something so beautiful about this drawing from so many different worlds of music that we obviously love a whole lot, but it manages to do so in a way that I just don't think any band who have dabbled in this sound have quite done it before. This is every bit as indebted to, at the drive-in as it is stuff like Dream Theater, or just fucking like there's just so many influences here, and it's so singular as an individual work in and of itself. And all of these influences make it sound like this could be a mess, but it feels so concentrated, it feels so focused. There's a reason that this band took so long to come back, I feel like, because this is an album that feels like, despite its relatively shorter runtime, the maximum amount of detail is put into songs like SRO, to the point where it just feels like nothing but instrumental highlight after instrumental highlight. They pared everything back and stripped it down to its absolute best, and nothing else was allowed. If anything was like, oh, this part's like an 8 out of 10, they said, no, fuck it, get rid of it. We're going for 10s all the way down. Fuck all of you. And I like, just fucking applause. Thank you, gospel. We will be preaching you.
One of my favorite things about this song is, like, first of all, like, there's so many different, like, just completely incongruous and almost like what's the word for it, like anachronistic, like musical reference points that it pulls from and then draws together. I mean, you start off with that burbling synth that sounds like super 80s, and then by the end of the song, you're having this intense fucking guitar, drum, and mellotron duel. Essentially, you have this fucking Beatles Strawberry Fields Forever ass mellotron flute that comes in the final fucking stretch of the song and ends up driving the main melody of that final intense stretch. It's one of the most exhilarating songs of the year for me on a pure raw experiential level. Like, every time I listen to this, my fucking heart rate shoots up, not just because it's heavy and loud and, you know, it's a fucking intense awesome metal song, but just because everything that it's doing fucking makes my blood pressure boil. Like, it just goes so intensely and in such a way that feels so giddily fun as well. And then again, part of that is because of all the different instrumentation that they're drawing together. I mean, here is a song where the finale is led by a mellotron, but it's also a track that has a saxophone on it. It's also a track that has blast beats on it. It's also a track that has, you know, a synth taken right from the fucking Weeknd album. It might as well be, you know, like, it's just the whole set of sonic, you know, choices that's made on this, and very representative of the album, as we'll talk about in our next video. But it's so just purely unique and exciting and inspiring and just energetic. And this is the thing I love about where gospel are at now, is that they've kind of lost touch. Not that they've already had it, but this is like so unconcerned with like tasteful execution of any of these implementations. It's all very kind of in your face and sort of cheeky in a way that I really, really love. And SRO is just, I agree, Jake, it's also my favorite song on the record. It's just complete giddy joy. I feel like a fucking kid at Christmas time when I'm listening to this. It's such a fucking present. Not that you can make any of it out as well, but since we're talking songs here, I want to shout out as well that the lyricism here is really excellent too. I mean, it's a song kind of about the process of aging, essentially, and the process of losing touch, I suppose, with the world around you as well, and this fear of like growing into this husk of what you once were, this person who will inevitably become completely out of touch with the world around them, this thing that you see around you that you absolutely are terrified of becoming. And that's just to represent that kind of like fear of becoming the corny or jaded or like kind of completely out of step with everything old person essentially that you see around you, representing that with a song that just borrows so much from 70s prog is kind of a little bit of a funny in-joke for anyone who's sort of like keeping count at home. All right, we're actually heading into a stretch here of where the next 3 songs on our list in this video are each of our individual favorite songs of the year, and they just sort of all ended up being together in this little cluster on our collective list. So first of all, we have
Sunlit light setting in the window.
This is just the song that hit me the hardest this year. And when you have the hour plus of the album that precedes it leading up to this, it's just set up to demolish you as it goes on. And it's just in a lot of ways it has a lot of kinship with my favorite song of the year last year, and that it's just this big, opulent, incredibly dense song that's all pure 100% emotional catharsis that feels like it just takes the context of the album that it's within and just uses all of it to just utterly ruin you. This just is a showcase for Ethel's incredible lyricism on here, and it just sort of ties everything together, referencing all the other songs on the album obliquely or directly in the lyrics here. But the thing about this song that I think puts it at my number one spot for this year is that overridingly, this is a song that is about one thing, if I had to boil it down to one thing, and that one thing is perseverance. 2022 has been like a really arduous year for a lot of people, myself included. So having a song like this that feels as big and grand as it is, and when in that kind of sweeping chorus of "if it's meant to be, then it will be" comes in at the very end, there are few moments in music as singularly powerful. I think the most emotional part of the song, like if I'm just like going through it piece by piece, is the part where she sort of just talks about, this is in the context of the record, this is a song that takes place after the main character, after Ethel has died essentially and gone to heaven and ascended to the afterlife. And the part that just absolutely just twists the knife in is what I wouldn't give to be in church this Sunday, listening to the choir so heartfelt, all singing, "God loves you, but not enough to save you. So baby girl, good luck taking care of yourself." And that's the whole album in one stanza, in that, you know, it's sort of a meditation on the fact that it's like, you know, in this record, Ethel's had a particularly difficult life, but now that it's gone and now that it's over, she misses something as innocuous and as like something that she didn't enjoy, as like being in church this Sunday. And that sort of comes back at, like she says at the very end, "I'm still praying for that house in Nebraska," which, God, in the context of the record, when that line comes up, I'm in fucking tears. "By the highway out on the edge of town, dancing with the windows open, I can't let go when something's broken. It's all I know and it's all I want to know." And you go back to a song like "House in Nebraska," and that's her talking about how much she misses a shitty, broken down house that like wasn't pleasant to live inside, but that she has all of these tangible memories of, and all of these relationships that are tied back into it. And so the fact that she misses it is just, it just emphasizes the strength of the main character going forward and looking back on all of the terrible things that happened to them, but still managing to find the valuable and beautiful parts of life. And that's what this song is to me, is that it's acknowledging the darkness of life and the universe, but still managing to find the things that are worth going forward with, that are, you know, the most valuable to you, the things that are the only things that have kept you on your feet for as long as you've been alive, because, you know, you're still here, you've managed to make it this far, and there's a reason for that. And everybody who's still here has those reasons, and you just hold on to them for as long and as tightly as you possibly can. And I just, God, man, fuck. It's so difficult to actually talk about this, but there is simply no better way to put it than, I have not felt more, just general, like a mix of emotions, I have not felt more in music this year than when I am at the chorus of Sun-Bleached Flies.
The part that really gets me is the part where actually in the bridge where she's, you know, she's talking about, you know, that moment that we all remember, "If it's meant to be, then it will be." And the part where she says, "I forgive it all as it comes back to me." That's one of the hardest lyrics on the record for me. This idea of like, you know, every traumatic, horrible thing that you've experienced collapsing backward onto you in a single moment, and just letting it go, just completely forgiving it all, just like completely letting it fly off of you. Like that to me is that what makes this such a hard-hitting moment in the record. And we'll talk in our albums video about what happens and how it builds to and why this is such a cathartic moment. But particularly that moment, that line where she talks about forgiving everything as it comes back to her, is just that's really, I hate that we always have to use words like powerful because they feel so rote in these contexts, but it's just really powerful.
I feel like that there's a universality that songs like this speak to, and that I think is an overriding theme with my sort of 3 favorite songs of the year for the last 3 years: Chinese Satellite, the end of the World is a Beautiful Place album last year, and the one this year, is that it just sort of feels like collectively we as a people, just like, people who are online, people who are often engaged in culture and discourse and discussion, we just kind of have all of these things happening to us, be it in like the world generally or in our personal lives, where it really does just feel like one thing after another, and it just sort of begins to feel like an avalanche, and it just feels incredibly overwhelming, and you feel some days like you're genuinely not going to be able to make it through and see the next day afterwards. And it's songs like this that really give you a moment to stop and reflect a little bit and just sort of take it all in and be like, yeah, all of that's hard, all of that's difficult, and I didn't want to go through all of that, but there is a reason that I did, and I am thankful for that reason. So it's not just about it being sad or it being powerful. It makes you feel grateful for, even if you are like, 99% of the world and the things in your life are terrible, it really makes you hold on to that 1% and really be grateful for it. And I can't tell you how much of that 1% this year for me has been music, has been this podcast, has been my friends. And the song of the year for me is always going to be what keeps me holding on to stuff. And that's why, to me, Sun Bleach Flies is the anthem of the year.
I've spent so much time this year listening to Big Thief, thinking about Big Thief, and as you'll know if you've been tuned to the channel recently, seeing Big Thief live as well, and then talking about the Big Thief concert experience. And so Big Thief, I mean, there's been a number of bands that have kind of consumed my life this year. I've already mentioned a couple of artists who've done that, but probably none more so than Big Thief in terms of not only releasing my favorite album of the year, which has my favorite song of the year on it, and capping off an incredible run of music. I mean, not even mentioning Adrian's solo music, which I've probably spent upwards of 30 or 40 hours this year listening to, even though it was only about 80 minutes of it in total. Everything that this band does captivates me, challenges me, and gets me excited about music, both compositionally, emotionally, and all the ways that music can excite you. And in a lot of ways, everything that's so great about them is just completely distilled and boiled down to its essence on the song Simulation Swarm, which is almost deceptively simple the first time that you hear it. I mean, it comes as well on the home stretch of their 80-minute 20-song album, and almost sort of blindsides you with its intensity after a few songs that feel like, I mean, the context of the record, this song comes after a few songs that feel a little bit like a come down, a little bit like a moment to breathe after some of the most musically intense stuff, which happens around the midpoint of the album. And then Simulation Swarm just kind of swoops in and completely levels you. I mean, this song is, I mean, where to begin? For starters, it has this beautiful little loping guitar line that is like so many guitar lines in so many Big Thief songs, where it sounds very simple at first, and then the more you listen to it, the more you realize how much is going on there, especially with how it's kind of double tracked and counter melodied as well. You have Adrian's voice, which is, barely above a whisper at the beginning of the song, but rises to this like very quiet urgency in the chorus as well, which is one of my, just a moment that completely undoes me. You have the verse in this song where she calls back to my favorite Big Thief song, which is Mythological Beauty off of Capacity, a song where she talks about in detail about her feelings about her long lost brother, Andy, who her mother gave up for adoption when they were both very young, like infancy. And so she never really ever got to know him, but she's kind of been haunted by him her entire life. She has no idea where he is, no idea what his life is like, no idea if he's even still alive. And occasionally he'll resurface like a ghost in her songwriting. Very rarely. I mean, at least in an overt way, very rarely. And he does in Simulation Swarm, and the context of that story being brought up as well. And this idea of the song as well, which is about essentially escaping and needing to escape and being sort of trapped within each and being kind of captive within the trappings of every aspect of your life as it exists. And I think the Simulation Swarm itself being the kind of obsessive idea of what could have been in your head, the fantasy. That's what a simulation swarm is, I think. It's like a fantasy, an imagined reality that you don't exist within, but that you spend an awful lot of time in thinking about and trying to picture how your life would be different if that timeline had existed and if you could live through it. And that's a really, for anyone who's ever lost someone, or for anyone who has any kind of regret, or for anyone who's ever gone through some kind of significant change, I think we all have a simulation swarm of some kind that we, when we're feeling particularly masochistic or weak, subject ourselves to. And I don't know, to have a song about that, especially from a band that I love so much, that has so much beautiful melodic stuff going on, as well as maybe the most understated acoustic guitar solo ever. And it's so beautiful that it's in the song twice. Jake, I know that obviously the record means a lot to you as well. We'll talk about that in the next videos. I know you like the song a lot too. Anything you want to add?
As somebody who has a real life experience that is not that dissimilar to the one Adrian describes in the song, involving a sibling that you feel a connection to who is separated from you in a way that feels kind of intangible. This is a song that is this is a song that literally makes listening to this album a difficult prospect for me now, because I've listened to this album so much, just because it's been such a great comfort for me this year, because it is such a warm, beautiful, comforting album. But getting to this, where it directly addresses this so potently with Adrian's lyricism that is as oblique as it is emotional, where she manages to balance something that feels like it shouldn't work in how hard it hits you, but nevertheless manages to anyway, because that's what great writers in rock music, I think, are particularly like. That's a sign that I think that you're one of the greats, is that when you manage to invent almost a style that feels all your own, you know, like a Tom Waits or a fucking Bob Dylan, where you manage to write something that only you could have written, but it still manages to not have a dulled impact by the sort of idiosyncrasy of its own style.
Adrian has a lyrical style, you know, it's a little bit obtuse. It takes a little bit of focus to absorb the things that she says. But one of the ways in which she conducts herself as a vocalist that makes her really captivating is that she can deliver lyrics that are obviously very deliberately written and incredibly artful and poetic and full of dense imagery, but she can deliver them in a way that makes them feel like pure stream of consciousness, as if they're just kind of pouring out of her completely unplanned. And she does that throughout Simulation Swarm. It's a great example of it. And the storytelling here as well, obviously, given that the most recognizable and clearly named person in the story is someone that Adrian has barely ever met, means that the other people referred to in the story are clearly very different, and she's drawing together different experiences that, you know, may even be entirely fictionalized for all we know. But the storytelling here is so powerful. There's a verse where she describes building an energy shield with someone in their room, and the way in which every line just kind of falls into the next line, and it just tumbles from this simple image of building an energy shield for, I don't know, what even has an energy shield, like a hot air balloon? I don't know. Building something massive, essentially, some
Spaceship.
cool, just completely absorbed by the pure joy of creation with someone. And then that image just completely mutating into this, talking about birds and fields and trees and maternal figures, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on. And it feels like you're completely being pulled on this journey through all these different ideas, images, things that represent, or things that are taken from this memory, or this fantasy, this simulation swarm, as I call it. All right. Number 7 on our list, Morgan's favorite song of the year.
It was a gracious old sunshine, but it was wasting on me.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on which song from this album to include as my favorite of the year. I thought about going with Goal of the Century for a while. The obvious pick to me, I think my favorite on the album when we reviewed it, was The Man Himself. I guess that's technically a 2021 song. But I think ultimately where I came down on it was the refrain in the chorus of this song. If the whole world was fair, it'd be me that was fighting for air.
And then it follows it up with the audacity to have one of the following lyrics be "The world is not done with me yet" is like, again, that's some right out of the Ethel Cain playbook. It's just like, all right.
And
all
all
right,
in the middle of this as well, you have this is such a Dave Leopepe thing to do. You have a fucking Simpsons reference in the Cosmic Ballet line, which is just like, it's so, the thing that really gets me about this song, and again, it's one of those things where this is a real deep cut, and one of the things that makes this album a masterpiece is that you come to appreciate every single song on this record on a deeply resonant level. But those things can hit you, they might hit you on the second or third listen, they might hit you on the 15th, but every song eventually does. And this one was one of the last ones to really fully connect with me. But I think when I realized that essentially the crux of this song, and we'll talk about the wider narrative when we talk about the album itself, but the moment in that narrative where this song occurs is a moment where Dave is reflecting on an event in his life that is the subject of the very first Gang of Youth song that ever really made an impact, essentially. Their first song that was, that kind of established them, essentially. That being Magnolia from their first album. A song in which Dave describes a near suicide attempt, essentially, that, he came very close to doing, basically. And that is a song where you get a really powerful sense of how pushed to the brink Dave was, and how his thread to reality was so, completely frayed that he was unable to really comprehend or see the gravity of what he was doing and how it was affecting people around him, right? And Forbearance is like, however many years it's been since that song was released, we're revisiting that event, but we're revisiting the aftermath of that event from an entirely new perspective, which is Dave actually coming to terms with how it affected his family, right? Because the song Magnolia is about him in that moment, and it's not really about anyone else, or at least the effect of that event on other people is hinted at, mentioned, I suppose, but not really the focus of the song. Whereas here it's like Dave is confronting death in a completely different context of his life much later, and thinking about this other time where it was a very close confrontation between him and death, essentially, and how frivolous that seemed, how kind of indulgent even that seemed, now that he is confronting the death of his father, which of course is what the album is about. And the way he describes, coming to terms with that, it has a really brutal impact, right? I mean, one of the thorniest aspects of the issue of suicide that can be difficult to discuss, because, if you don't discuss it with nuance, then it can come across as though you're talking about assigning blame or you're casting suicide as this inherently selfish act or whatever. It's a really difficult thing to talk about in the issue of suicide, which is how it affects people close to the person in question. And it's a tough issue to tackle. And Forbearance is maybe the best song I've ever heard that even remotely tries to do that, because it's all about death in context, right? It's all about the whole record. Angel in Real Time is about how we come to understand death when it's close to us, when we have to deal with it as directly affecting someone else and peripherally affecting our own lives. And here's a moment where Dave gets to reflect on how his previous attitudes toward death, his previous views on his own death, his previous laissez-faire attitude towards his life when he was younger, how that has come back to affect him now that he is, against his will, being forced to stare death in the face in a different context. And yeah, the way he talks about it in the song is gut-wrenching, right? Especially the way he describes that the aftermath of his suicide attempt, essentially, where he the first time he saw his father after that, and the look on his father's face, he describes it as a fate worse than death. And that whole idea of not just disappointing the ones you love as well, but hurting them, and the way that we process our own pain through the lens of how other people are affected by it. It's too much for me to really get into a whole lot of depth about, because it's a really complicated issue, and we're just talking about a fucking song. But that to me is the thing that really makes this song stand out, is that on a record that is consumed with dealing with death in various different ways, and legacy and life, and the tumultuousness of family, here's a song that touches on a particular family issue that is very seldom written about, and also manages to find a certain level of optimism and, forward looking through the issue, again, with that "world is not done with me" line, where you realize that, in spite of all of this, the lesson you have to take away from all of it is about the future, not about dwelling pointlessly on what you did and didn't do. And it's an amazing song, right? It's just gorgeous. Especially like the breakdown in the middle when the fucking choral vocals come back in and the whole thing just swells like this breathing creature, right? Like, it's just structurally really just...
Yeah, it's fascinating how many songs on this album feel like living entities unto themselves. I think that's ultimately why I went with Forbearance over any of the other candidates, is just because I feel like there's the most going on here, maybe, out of the whole album, and the way that it interacts with and connects with the writing of it, and the urgency of the story being told, being enhanced through the music. There's no one doing it like these guys, and these are my guys. And this is the best song of the year.
Number 6 on our list is the longest motherfucking song on this list by far. And I think, like, not only is this a monumental song, it kind of is like a monumental moment for this band, not just in their own progression as well, because it definitely feels like them deliberately making a statement musically that is just kind of ushering in this new era for them, post a whole bunch of changes in lineup and weird experiments through the Bizarro albums they've put out in the last few years. It feels like wiping the slate clean completely and just doing the biggest, most bombastic, most fucking nutso shit they have ever done. And it's telling that as the first piece of music that they put out in this new run, not the first this year, because you had Made in Timeland earlier this year, which is whatever. But like the fact that they've released 3 records since the album that this song is on, and that are all in their own way great, by the way, none of which are throwaway in any sense. But this song, it still endures in my memory as a real tribute to it. I mean, I think this is genuinely King Gizzard's best song. And it is like, I listened to it again this morning. I was like, fuck, it's just Oh, they go so hard on the fucking track. Just Jake, talk about the song.
I think that it's a testament to how strong of a year King Gizzard had, is that regardless of whether or not this song came out this year, I'm fairly confident that a King Gizzard song would land on this list somewhere. It just happened to be this one. And I do agree with Riley. I actually also, as probably the biggest fan of this band on the podcast, I do think that this is their best song. It's their most ambitious. It's their most, it feels also like it's the song that embodies the spirit of King Gizzard the best as well, just because it manages to combine the sort of like center point of all of their influences and all of the genres that they take on to make this fucking blues prog epic that just manages to slam for every minute. And it's got the dripping tap won't be turned off.
That fucking blues, like slow down blues
charge
intro where he's doing exactly what you're doing, and then the way that they bring that back, like fucking 16 minutes later at the very end of the song, sped up in the context of the big guitar freak out that you've been getting the entire time. Like, and it's a fucking miracle that just no matter how many times I listen to this, somehow the dip from the tap, don't step on the drip does not get annoying. That should be, by all rights, that should be the most irritating thing in the world. Yet every time it gets to that section, I'm just like, dip from the tap, don't step on the drip.
I mean, it's this immensely long song, the longest song they've released up until this point, and they've had some other long songs, especially on the albums they've released this year, and it's still the song of theirs that I listened to the most this year. And I think the really rewarding thing about it is that not only is it King Gizzard's best, most ambitious, biggest, most slammin', most fun song, is that it also just sort of reasserts them after a period where I think that generally speaking, that like, you know, it's not like we were all convinced that King Gizzard were washed or anything, but it just sort of felt like their moment in the spotlight was probably gone. It's just that, you know, they had so many big years where they had the year where they released 5 albums, the year where they made a thrash metal and a fucking boogie album. And it sort of just felt like they had their moment that just sort of came and went, and that they would sort of be here because they had accrued a following, but they weren't going to be at the forefront of the musical conversation anymore, just because they were seemingly exploring older territory that they'd gone back on. Whereas this year they release Omnium Gatherum, they released Ice, Death, Mushrooms, Lava, fucking whatever the hell else. It's just like every release of theirs this year felt essential in a way that they haven't in years, I think. And it just really makes you confident in King Gizzard as a band and as an entity once again to make cool, new, exciting music. And as they are one of my favorite working bands, it's just nice to be like, I'm excited for their output again. And that feels so nice, so wonderful for such a great, fun band.
Also, like, funkiest song ever about oil drilling, which is like ostensibly the dripping tap itself. Like, King Gizzard have shown, I think, a more and more of a proclivity towards writing about like sort of massive sort of cultural and social and political issues, but they're always able to find this kind of not necessarily absurdist, but just this kind of like tongue-in-cheek sort of like irreverent spin, where it's sort of like, you know, you're able to just have a raucously good time listening to something that is very blankly about quite a difficult and ugly subject matter. And so, yeah, I think this is maybe the biggest success that they found in this vein. And again, on the Ice, Lungs, etc. record, which is the best of the records they put out this year, I think they do that over and over again, many, many, many different times to great effect as well. And if this weren't released this year, then one of those songs would absolutely be on my list. Yeah, for sure. Amazing stuff. All right, now it's time for the top 5 best songs of the year as per us. And number 5 goes to...
Don't get emotional, that ain't like...
If you were to tell me a year ago that a fucking Arctic Monkeys song would be in our top 5 songs of the year collectively, or even that it would be one of my favorite songs of the year. I would have been very surprised, but probably would have accepted it fairly quickly, I suppose, because that's worse, weirder things that have happened. But anyway, that kind of detracts from my point. It's an amazing song. It is the opening track from their new album, The Car, which, you know, we did review fairly, or we weren't all that enthusiastic about. I don't actually think we did review it fully, did we? I can't remember.
No, I mean, we kind of did, and I think you're kind of underselling the sheer ambivalence that we all had towards the record, frankly.
Yeah, it was kind of like a continuation of their tranquility-based sound, except without the overarching concept to anchor that particular take on lounge music. But all that said, it can't take away from the fact that the opening track, There Better Be a Mirror Ball, is one of the most musically, not startling, but like kind of captivating songs of the year. There's a patience to it, but also at the same time, there's a kind of very gentle beauty, like the continually sort of undulating main melodic core of it, in contrast with the very sort of Steely Dan-esque, powerful but beautifully soft, radiant chords that are just kind of hit to sort of stab through the motion of that undulating melody is just super gorgeous and pretty. And Alex Turner finds a way to pitch his voice, which is very much settled into this kind of like, you know, soulful croon, in a way where he feels like he's kind of dancing and snaking around these different musical components so beautifully. It's almost like a high wire act of musical construction, basically, which is a funny thing to say because it's such a slow paced, gentle song. But every element of it feels like it's very close to something that shouldn't really work all that well, or kind of could very easily fall flat. But it finds this space to just hang in for 3 minutes that I think is just gorgeous. It's beautiful. I think it is. I think I said when we did our not review of this, that this is probably my favorite Arctic Monkeys song. You know, and I'm not someone who finds them to be, you know, boring or uninteresting or all that sort of jazz. I like their first 3 records a lot, particularly their first album. I think that A Certain Romance is like one of the best rock songs of the 2000s. So for me to call this new track their best song is not, you know, it's not faint praise. But yeah, Morgan, I know this was a song that featured pretty prominently on your list as well. I mean, what do you think? What really struck you about this track?
I mean, I never once thought that Arctic Monkeys would be a good candidate to do the next Bond theme song, but here we are. If this itself were to be a Bond theme song, it would be like in the top 5 of them ever. I have a pretty ambivalent relationship to Arctic Monkeys. They're a handful of just undeniable songs that they have, and then, you know, there's the rest of their career. I didn't expect to like this as much as I did, to such a degree that it's the first track on the album, and I put it on and I listened to that, and then the next song on it was so fucking mid that I just forgot about listening to the album altogether. I just hit the back button, which is more than enough for me. It's like such a quietly devastating song as well. I find it to be really sort of powerful, stealthily, and it just sounds so lush and rich.
One of the things I will say is that, you know, for as disappointing as the album itself was, I don't think Alex Turner is lost. In fact, I would say as a lyricist, an attribute that he's particularly become very good at, and to be fair, can really be seen as far back as their debut album, is that he's actually a really great character storyteller. Like, he's really great at just putting you in the shoes of a character and letting you not only experience what they experience, but experience it the way they experience it as well. And this is a song is a great example because on paper, it's a fairly textbook breakup song. Like, it's a song essentially about, you know, it's about being broken up with specifically. And it's about sort of that moment of departure from whatever space that's happening in. But like on a deeper level as well, there's so much in the lyricism here that communicates so much stuff about the person that who the song is speaking from the perspective of, about the person who's being broken up with. You get a sense that this is a person who has a very high ego, who thinks very highly of themselves, who is almost in a like Humbert way, trying to like paint a portrait of what is happening through their own lens and trying to completely change and, you know, sort of muddle the details so that suddenly they look as though they're emerging out of this with more dignity than the other person, essentially, even though the details suggest that maybe what the other person is doing is arguably more dignified. But I love this kind of storytelling where it's kind of like unreliable narrator storytelling, basically, right? Where he's telling, you know, he's giving you, drip feeding you details of this event, but the way he speaks about it, the turns of phrase that he uses, the little details and inflections and all those sorts of things give you the impression that this is someone who is basically recasting this event in their own light, right? Like the very first line of the song is "Don't get emotional, that ain't like you." And then when you hear the rest of the song, it's very clear that this person is the more emotional of the two in this situation, right? But yet is kind of projecting that onto the other person. You know, yesterday's still leaking through the roof, which is a great lyric. And then he's like, you know, trying to recast his own sort of melodramatic, you know, emotional response to being broken up with. And he describes it as, I know that I promise this is what I wouldn't do. Somehow giving it the old romantic fool seems to better suit the mood, right? You know, and that immediately you realize like this is probably someone who's begging, you know, this other person not to leave. And yet he's recasting it in the story as being the old romantic fool because it's better for the vibe. If you want to walk me to the car, you ought to know I'll have a heavy heart, right? This kind of like putting the onus on this other person for their emotional state. And then that kind of offhand, absurd line about there being a mirror ball in the car, essentially, this sort of like idea of chintzy 80s swag or whatever, like this idea of like trying to project some kind of like old-fashioned coolness that just seems really anachronistic and goofy, right? And the whole song goes on like this as well, like calling this other person cynical and, you know, basically tearing them apart. But the whole time, every single line feels like it's just carries this devastating weight of just complete hopelessness that this person cannot change the situation or the reality of it. So all they can do is construct their own reality. And I love that kind of storytelling. To me, that is really, when it's done well, and it's a hard thing to do well, to be fair, it can be really, really captivating and also kind of challenges your perceptions as a listener and challenges the extent to which you just absorb what's given to you on the page and how much do you actually kind of, you know, push back against it. And not that, you know, any of this stuff is the main reason that anyone listens to an Arctic Monkeys song, but I do think that these are the things that accentuate what comes through emotionally in the sound of the song, and also what makes it, you know, above and beyond just a pretty sounding song and something that actually feels, you know, really great from a construction standpoint and really memorable. And I love the idea of this being a Bond theme, because it's like, this would have to be a very different vision of Bond as this. I like the idea of kind of reimagining Bond as this hyper masculine but deeply insecure and deeply small human being who is completely powerless to control anything in their life, the polar opposite of how we conventionally imagine Bond. Not that, you know, there's anything about this that is explicitly intended to reflect Bond, but I just like the idea of riffing on that. So yeah, amazing song, I think. And, you know, even if we didn't enjoy the album, who cares? Like, you make a song that's good enough for a list like this, then, and that's a good, that's good. Well done on that one. All right, number 4 on our list of the best songs of the year is
I'm doing this for revenge.
There has not been a more immediate vocal hook than this song released in fucking ever, maybe. I don't fucking know. That's just the thing about this song, is that it feels like John Darnielle sat down with the express intent of lyrically and musically making the movie training montage music song to end them all. As in, like, if this doesn't make it into a movie eventually down the line, I'm gonna be sorely disappointed. Hollywood, you're sleeping on some good material here. This is just like written so perfectly to evoke the feeling of listening to shit like Eye of the Tiger, but it's like this rocky ass indie folk fucking thing, and it's just the hardest this band have ever sounded. And it's also it's written though in this quintessentially John Darnielle way, the the water dripping from the pipes down in the basement, bare feet on a concrete floor, notches on the wall of my solitary cell, sweat dripping out of every pore. Like the character with which the delivery he has with every single syllable of this has so much color and flair and fun. And it's just, again, I've listened to this more than most songs released this year, just because it's one of those, like, play it in your car as you're driving down the road at full fucking speed, just the fucking everybody ready for justice, just another mile to go. And it sort of reveals, it's like it's kind of like a lot of other songs on this list, and it just kind of showcases a new facet of an already existing band that they display with such virtuosic confidence that you're just impressed that this is the first time you're hearing something like this from a band like the Mountain Goats. But it also just, like, I don't know, it's a deeply fun song that's also written with a deep amount of, like, emotional catharsis as well. Just the way that the gang vocals come in on, they had to, I'm doing this for the ones they had to leave behind, I'm doing this for you. It could sound trite in the hands of an unskilled songwriter or an unskilled performer, but John Darnielle is proving that the Mountain Goats are just as vital of a band as they were fucking 20 years ago, and just coming through with a new sound and a new style that works, that he just kind of wears like a glove. Like, we're all really big fans of John, we're all really big fans of the Mountain Goats, and it's just kind of awesome that a band this late into their career is giving you things you didn't even know that you really wanted from them. There's no shortage of great songs on Bleed Out that we could have picked for this, but I think that this is certainly the song that feels the most emblematic of the sonic shift that they went for here. It's just one of the most fun songs of the year, full stop.
Mountain greatest of all time.
They ain't mountain sheep, I'll tell you that. Anyway,
That's
don't what does that mean?
okay, moving on to our top 3 of the year, and capping it off, number 3 on our list is when I was compiling this list, this overall list, I was frankly a little bit surprised that this song ended up making it as high as it did. I mean, well, to be fair, it was in all 3 of our top 20 songs of the year list, and that's only true of 2 songs in this video. But still, all the same, I was surprised that something that seems on the surface, to be just a fairly simple, if quite powerful pop song, had really resonated with all 3 of us this much. But then I listened to it again, and in retrospect, it doesn't seem so surprising. I mean, this is, for starters, it can't really be overstated, a perfect pop song, and it's something that feels like, I don't want to say we're in a particularly bad time for pop music, or even like great pop songs from alternative sort of artists, but it's certainly a sort of thing that I value really highly when it happens. And coming from a band like Let's Eat Grandma, who put out one of my absolute favorite records of the last decade, the amazing I'm All Ears. And I mean, of course, to the surprise of no one, we will talk about the album that this is on in more detail in our next video. But to have such a perfect pop song emerge on this record, it's not all that surprising. Although it is and it isn't, like, because I'm All Ears has a couple of perfect pop songs on it, but it's also a really sort of dense record that goes into some really unusual places and sort of spreads itself out and sprawls a little bit. And their new album wisely doesn't do that. Levitation, I think, being the most immediate point of entry as well. It is, like many Let's Eat Grandma songs, a song about the relationship and the connection and the friendship between Jenny and Rosa, the two girls who are Let's Eat Grandma. Essentially, a lot of their music is about their friendship. And I mean, the album Two Ribbons as well is a record about as much about the downs of that friendship as the ups. But Levitation is this magnetic song that so beautifully and powerfully, and immediately conveys that feeling of being drawn to someone, where no matter what happens between you and another person, how you can never really escape the sort of gravitational orbit of that person. The music video communicates this really beautifully as well. I think it's Jenny who's sitting on a train, and essentially Rosa is her reflection through the glass window. And it's very much like, making a visual metaphor or a visual representation of the theme and idea of this song. But yeah, I mean, what do you guys think? I mean, what was really stood out to you, and what made this song feel so special to you guys?
I mean, this is just like the most tightly produced synth pop song since Carly Rae Jepsen's Run Away With Me. Every sound, every synth line is immaculate to the point of just utter brilliance. Like I'm infuriated a little bit that this album wasn't bigger than it was, because I think it deserved to be, because it had the hits on here. Like, this was by no means the only great straight up synth pop song on here. I think Happy New Year and Watching You Go are songs that could just as easily be on this place in the list as Levitation. But just everything about the delivery of this is so fucking confident. I like just down to every last microscopic detail. I love how you can hear the sort of Britishness in their voice, like when they sing the fucking bodies move like levitation. It's so fucking, like, you could just hear it just a tiny little bit. And I've listened to it so much that stuff like that sticks with me as little tiny itty bitty bits of personality. And it's so groovy and rhythmically oriented that these like vocal lines, they're not like easy to sing along with, but they're really easy to move to. So this is like a perfect dance pop tune in many respects as well. It has such a perfect structure. It sounds incredible. I never got tired of this record throughout the entirety of the year, and I certainly never got tired of this song. Just a huge, like, I don't know, that you just rarely ever get songs that are this vacuum sealed to perfection.
Yeah, that theme of friendship as well, and that theme of like the communion of two people is so powerful here. Like, it's something they touch on a little bit on the last album, but this record is kind of completely and holistically about that. And I like the way that on this song as well, that Jenny and Rosa are essentially trading off lyrics, right? Like, Jenny is singing the majority of it, but then Rosa will come in to deliver some counterpoint or to deliver another half of the verse. And I like how the switching between the two of them is reflected in the lyricism as well. I call you near from somewhere else. Are you here or somewhere else? That sense again of having a particular person who, whenever you need them, you can essentially call for them, either literally or even just through the sheer willpower, and have them be conjured up. It's also just great to have a massive synth pop song about friendship as well, as opposed to any of the other like myriad of like, love based or whatever based pop songs. Just to have I don't want to use a word like wholesome necessarily, because it sounds weirdly like a dig.
The whole album is very wholesome, and well, I would say that it's very affirming on the subject of friendship, because it's by no means a skin deep exploration. It explores some uglier aspects and difficult aspects of friendship and maintaining friendship specifically, but just sort of the beauty of friendship that can make it out from situations like that, not necessarily unscathed, but still stronger after just like a whole lot of adversity between you, like personally. And this sort of feels like the center point that kind of anchors something that's that strong and that beautiful. And it just feels so, man, that little tiny itty bitty key change on the final. It's like
also just
fuck,
such a
shit.
such a moment for Jenny as a vocalist as well. Like she really hit some high notes on this track that I've not heard her hit before, or at least certainly not with the level of power in the voice and in the vocal that's pushed through on those as well. It's just an utterly triumphant moment for one of the best sort of alternative synth pop bands working today, and it's great to see them continue to go from strength to strength. Number 2 on our Songs of the Year list.
And what if I sell my soul? What if I don't?
Everything album has, you know, that one song that you just immediately go back to, that you can just kind of rock along to, like Desire on A Fever Dream, or the first 5 fucking songs on Get to Heaven. But, you know, we've spilled our guts about how much we love this band so many times that I feel like it's sort of an inevitability that them making an album or a song like this is going to land them on our end of the year list. But this is another instance of a song that's just so vacuum sealed in how tight it is that it just had no other option than being somewhere on the top of all of our rotations. This is just one of the catchiest songs. A band that almost exclusively specializes in making some of the most weirdly catchy songs you've ever heard has made. And frankly, I mean, that's the thing, is that Morgan, the lizard brain reaction to the "don't talk a lot, talk a lot," but I don't even know the fucking, like, the details of the minutia of the lyrics in the main part of this song. And I've listened to this song 200 times this year, but Jonathan Higgs is just that bitch. You know, he makes the most uncatchy shit the best hook you've ever heard.
The great thing about this song is that the lyrics themselves feel at times kind of like incomplete or weirdly non-specific. Again, there's a robotic element to the way that they're constructed and the way that they're delivered as well. Not to mention the heavy indie-tronica instrumental that kind of fuses classical indie-tronica, which is a hilarious 2-word phrase that I just made up, and IDM to a certain extent as well. Like there's a good amount of IDM influence coming through here. I mean, listen to the completely just disorienting way that the song begins before it starts to find its own sort of rhythm and groove. There's like the whole thing about every element of the song is it feels like brittle and kind of thin. And it's like these little, it's kind of like a pointillist pop song. These little like dots of sound essentially that are kind of just interweaving with each other and finding these very sleek and simple dance rhythms. All the while, John is like crafting these bizarre lyrics about like miscommunication, but also like a relationship or an encounter or an experience with another where there's no way of understanding one another, but that almost doesn't matter. You don't talk a lot, but I like it. I can't tell you everything that went on. There's a sense of recovery and healing that comes through in this song as well. And it's like a kind of healing that comes through acceptance of things that you can't understand or influence. Maybe this will take a little time to heal because I'm hurting and I don't want to go back down inside of me. I'm a liar, but I'm lying next to you, which is like a beautiful little line. I've always loved so much ever since I first heard it. And there's that great moment as well in the midsection of the song where he says, like, it feels like a fucking dozen times he says, "I feel all right, I feel good," in the most unconvincing voice possible. And it's like this little
feel okay.
It's like this little, this little tiny kind of robot who's like repeating this idea over and over again, as though repeating it is enough to make it exist as a feeling inside of him. And the whole record, which we'll get into in our next video, embodies that feeling to a certain extent. But Teletype, as one of the best opening tracks of the year, really feels like the beginning of something new for everything, but also just the beginning of a new way of discovering and experiencing emotion and happiness and just power in the way that you feel after a long period of being numb. And that's what the song is like to me. It's like something or someone that has been numb or lifeless for an incredibly long period of time, suddenly having a switch flicked and having to process essentially that new stimulation, that new experience. And it's a great way, and that is a great metaphor as well for, falling in love, or for discovering something or someone or whatever it is that animates you after a period of stagnation or whatever. It's a great metaphor for that feeling. And it's also the catchiest song of 2022.
The thing that I keep coming back to with this song is the little riff in the verse that Alex plays, where it's like it's like
So
it's
good.
it's part of the main melody, but it's like sort of almost buried under Higgs's vocals. But when you key into it, it's like arrow getting the good part of your brain scratched.
Yeah, Alex's guitar playing, and he's always been a very distinctive and underestimated for how technically talented he is of a guitar player. He's great at just finding and feeding into texture, and also combining texture with complexity. He's great at all that sort of stuff. All right, well, without further ado, that leaves us with only one song left to discuss. Our number one song of the year, and a song that appeared on all three of our songs of the year lists. In fact, not only did this song appear on all three of our songs of the year list, it was in all three of our top 10 songs of the year. And that is
Can't explain like a sprain, I didn't really feel it.
This song contains maybe one of the most subtle key changes on this entire album, which we've gone into detail about what makes all of the songs on this album so fucking great. And we say that Alvvays have perfected the art of a key change. And it almost feels like it's subverted at the very end here, because it's the only key change on this album where I feel like it segues into a key that is less like triumphant and bigger sounding than what it was previously. It actually becomes a little bit smaller and a little bit more low key. You sort of have this moment in the song in the second half where I feel like this is one of my favorite moments on the record, that I had to live with it long enough to be able to identify it as a moment. But it's the fucking bridge at the end here where it's she talks about moving to the country, gonna have that baby, wait tables in town. And it's about, I mean, this whole album is just, it really speaks to the experience, I think, of being like a post-collegiate in the world right now. At least to me, it did. And this is just a song about being broke and having a shitty job and wanting to move somewhere where you think you're going to have a better life. And it sounds like that could really be kind of mournful. And in some respects it is. I think this is a really multifaceted song. I think it has a lot of emotional layers to it, but it ultimately focuses on the notion of like, it's not about being, it's like it sort of taps into the whole like grass is greener on the other side tendency. And it focuses on the change of being what's more important. It's not about where you're coming from or where you're going. It's about going somewhere. It's about finding the adventure. It's about finding what moves you from one place to the next. It's about being in the minutia of life and just being alive. Like, it opens with this lyric about I can't explain my ankle sprain. I didn't really feel it. It's just, you're so caught up in the moment and what moves you that you don't even fully recognize what could be slowing you down in the process. And I just think that's a perfect emblem to this album. It's all about feeling in the moment. It's all about taking just the time to stand and recognize the beauty of what's around you, and not really thinking about and taking into account some of the bad things that might have taken you, from one place to the other. It's not about like, it's, acknowledging the anxieties of the future, but just sort of learning to stop and smell the roses. And that's such a, I think, undervalued topic for a song to even be about in the first place, is that it's just, it's very difficult to feel this earnest and mean it, and to feel genuine without coming across as trite. But every single word here is performed with such intensity. You just feel alive when you hear this shit.
To me, like, this is a song about escapism. Like, there's a numbness that is communicated right from the beginning with the ankle sprain line as well, and that refrain of feeling paralyzed, and then this escapism that the song just falls into as well. That idea of moving to the country and aggressing to Inverness with nothing in my pocket and that sort of thing, and the key change as well is a big part of that too as well. It's this idea, you know, it separates the realm of what's real from the realm of what's fantasy in this song. And, you know, it's my second favorite song of the year behind Simulation Swarm, which is another song that is kind of about fantasy and about imagining a different reality for yourself. And this song is like a particularly devastating way of envisioning that as well. Like, I mean, it's in being a deliberate rebuke to heaven as a place on earth, which, again, remember the context for that lyric in that song is making heaven a place on earth, not that it already is one, essentially. And so there's this kind of fatalism in the escapism of this song, where it's like, you know, I'll start another life, I'll move to Inverness, I'll wait tables, all that sort of like very cliche stuff. But there's this way in which, because of the fact that it is so cliche and she uses cliches to express it, there's this tacit knowledge, or at least like communication there, that this fantasy is fake and unrealistic and could never be an actual option. And there's almost like a sense of disdain that Molly has for herself, for even indulging in it. And the way that she references the Belinda Carlisle song almost in a way to rebuke it. Belinda says heaven is a place on earth, well, so is hell. And I like that she kind of misses the point of this song that she's referencing when she does that, because it speaks to how blinded by cynicism that Molly is in this song. And I love that. Like, I like that, you know, it's a song about viewing the world in a particular lens that is undeniably affected by being depressed and feeling hopeless. And it's a song that embodies that feeling and gives you a sense of real catharsis out of it as well. I mean, this is a cathartic song. The way that she hangs on those words, paradise and paralyzed and terrified, in that chorus, the way that she just really puts so much power and longing and just helplessness into the delivery of those words genuinely brings me to tears when I listen to this song. And to have this song alongside Simulation Swarm, for me, it's these two different viewpoints on escaping, on imagining how things could be different from you. And Simulation Swarm, it's this idea that alternate ways in which your life could have gone if things were different, or like dwelling in memories that become entirely different worlds with the way that you embellish them in your mind, and the way in which you create kind of offshoots or go on these sort of stream of consciousness tangents from one memory into a whole new reality that could spring forth from it. That to me feels like a song that embodies all of the endless possibility and hope that can come out of the fact, a consciousness of the one reality just being pure chance. Whereas this song is the flip side of that. It is a cynical look at the current reality as being the only thing that's real, and fantasy being pointless and in many ways damaging. And it's just these two different perspectives that I think reflect fairly potently the different ways that I feel about my own relationship with nostalgia, my own relationship with my memories, my own relationship with my view of the future on any given day. I'm going to be in one of two modes. But yeah, so anyway, Always, Belinda Says, is a beautifully perfect song because it is communicating a very simple and relatable and just kind of unnuanced in a certain way feeling, but it's just leaning into that so heavily, and it's giving you this absolute adrenaline rush of gorgeous music and instrumentation and a key change, as mentioned, that lets you feel alive through this most cynical of thought patterns.
My God, if you don't feel anything in the last 30 seconds of this song, you need some milk.
Pack it up.
Get some medication.
Yeah, it's a song about numbness. It's a song about being so numb that you can't really feel that much. That makes you feel in spite of that. It's a weird thing. But yeah, I think it's fitting that it's ended up being our song of the year because it feels so much. It feels like so much of our this is such a mean thing to say. I feel like so much of our personalities and what we like about music and what we value and the power of what music can give the three of us specifically is in this song. Yeah, and it just embodies everything that we love and everything that we look for. And that's why it's our song of the year. And that brings us to the end of this video. Let us know what you thought of our picks for the best songs of 2022. What were your favorite songs of the year as well? What did you feel that we could have included but didn't? Let us know in the comments below. Show us your lists as well. If you've got a full ass list, want to see that shit, drop that in the comments below as well. We love hearing from you. We love hearing your takes on our opinions as well. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you have not already. Both those things help us a lot to continue doing what we've been doing. We've been loving the additional attention we've been getting lately as well for some of the lists and some of the music that content that we've been doing, reflecting on the year that has passed, and we're excited to continue doing that in the next few videos. As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, lays. Bet you can't eat just one.